Alright, so this is 3000th Duel, which is something that I find kind of difficult to say quickly. It is a Metroidvania with some kind of Souls-like elements, and it's probably something that you'll be fairly familiar with if you've played a lot of modern Metroidvania games. It does do a lot of what they have done in the past, although it is fairly unique for a couple of reasons. Now, something interesting about this, there is this this sort of small PR agency that kind of just occasionally emails me with games and says, you know, would you be interested in taking a look at this? And I really like getting emails from them because a lot of times there are things I've never heard of before, and they're things that are kind of small little gems, stuff that would have passed me by otherwise, that I just simply, there is no like marketing for or anything, you know, just really small games. I try to find a lot of those myself because it's always fun and rewarding really for me to try and make videos on a lot of smaller developers' games and just try and find some little hidden things that you can dig for on Steam. But there are a lot of games on Steam, and occasionally things will pass me by, so I always look at these emails because there's usually just tons of interesting stuff to see, and that is how I actually found out about this game. It's something that definitely would have passed me by had I not heard of it from them, because I've seen or heard nothing about it, and that's actually kind of a shame, because it turns out it's really fun, and it's actually a deceptively large game. The game is $15. It's on sale right now for like 12-ish, $11.50, somewhere around that kind of range. And that price does not really reflect the amount of stuff on offer in the game. The game's actually pretty huge. I was actually surprised when I got into it, just starting to explore the map and things like that. After several hours of play, I looked at the map and it has a percentage based on, you know, very much like in the Castlevania vein of things, where it shows you a percentage of how much of the total world map that you've explored so far. And it was still in like the really early single digits, like 5%. And that just made me realize how large the game actually is. There's a lot to explore. There's a huge amount of interconnected world here to actually go through. There are just constantly new enemy types and new bosses to face, new spells to find, and it's just this big experience that I wasn't expecting for such a small price. I just, you know, it was this little hidden thing that I never knew about, so suddenly coming across it and it being this deceptively large, fairly deep and complex like Metroidvania RPG, that was not what I was expecting, and it was a very pleasant surprise, so I wanted to share it with everyone here. Now, I did mention that it is a Metroidvania, and that comes along with pretty much everything that you'd expect from that genre. There's a lot to explore, a lot of branching pathways, you know, your teleporters, your save rooms, your bosses, your platforms that you can't quite reach yet because you need like a wall jump or a double jump or something, your various colored doors that you'll have to find keys to get through, all that sort of thing. It's all present here. It's a very competent Metroidvania, and those elements are pretty much as you would expect. They're all in place correctly, basically. And on top of that, I also mentioned that it has some Souls-like elements, and it in fact does. The leveling system is very Souls-esque, and a lot of the gameplay does take a lot of cues from those games in the kind of way that you would probably expect if you've played other games that try to take some elements from the Souls games. So you have, for instance, a very Estus-like healing system where, you know, you have a limited number of these healing items that you can use, and you can upgrade how much they heal you or how many you can carry each time. And you have to go back to a safe area in order to replenish them, rather than them being consumables, very much like an Estus flask. And you also, of course, have a sort of soul-like currency. In this case, it is called karma, and you, of course, get it from killing enemies, and especially from killing bosses. You can also find shards of karma that you can use, very much like the loose souls, to give yourself a bunch more that you really ideally want to use in safe areas so you don't accidentally lose them. And of course, when you die, you lose all of the karma that you are currently holding, and there will be this sort of purplish orb thingy that is left behind, and you have to go back to the room where you died and attack it a couple times to get it back. Very Hollow Knight-esque, honestly, in that sense. And there's also a leveling system that involves taking the karma that you have gathered and putting it into your stats. It is a much simpler version of something like the Dark Souls leveling system, but it is obviously very heavily inspired by that. You can't really, you know, get around it. It has 4 stats. You have a sort of vitality, or like a life and HP stat, and you have a attack damage stat, a magic damage, and then a stamina stat. And the stamina is very important in this game because it works a little bit differently than you expect. In a lot of sort of Souls-like combat systems, stamina is used as you attack. In this case, it is not. However, you do need to dodge quite a lot. You have a sort of dash that you can use, and it does give you some immunity frames, and it is very important because, especially in 2D, you only have, you know, a few directions that you can actually dodge. You don't have a full 3-dimensional depth to roll around in, so that means dodging enemy attacks often involves going through them. And dodging takes a lot of your stamina, I've noticed. It actually takes about 4 or 5 levels worth into the stamina increasing stat in order to get the stamina gauge large enough to actually hold more than one dash at a time. It takes a lot. So like for the first several levels, you will only have 1 dash worth of stamina. It will consume the entire gauge. It was actually to the point where at first I thought that 1 dash always consumed the whole gauge, and it was supposed to be like a sort of use it slowly kind of thing, but no, you actually can get more than 1. It just takes a lot of levels to do it, which is an interesting way to do things, although because this gauge is not also tied to attacking, it does make it still feel fairly mobile, and it's actually quite a fast game because you can attack and dodge separately from this. This meter doesn't, govern the entire combat system. So it doesn't feel too weighted down. It is quite, I'm not going to say floaty, that's not really all that descriptive. It's quite light and hectic, and you're meant to be very mobile. But one thing I will say is the attack is somewhat at odds to that, because attacking roots you in place. Whether you do it in midair or on the ground, you are kind of immobile for a minute as the attack animation goes off, and the attack animations aren't exactly slow, but they are somewhat long. So for like a good second as you're attacking, you won't be able to move at all, so this is good and bad. It's good because in the same way as something like Dark Souls, which this is obviously trying to kind of harken back to a little bit, it does give a feeling of weight and a certain feeling of making sure that your attacks are things that you do when you feel you have the safe window to do them, and not just spammy light attacks that don't really feel all that weighty or impactful. They do actually have some impact to them, but on the flip side to that, it is somewhat at odds with the otherwise quite fast and frenetic gameplay of dodging around quite a lot and just constantly moving in like a two-dimensional space, since you won't really be moving all that much when you decide to attack. It kind of roots you down. So it's something that you have to get used to. I'm not going to say that it's clunky, but it does feel a little strange at first, and you definitely have to get used to the way that the separation feels between when you actually commit to an attack and when you're supposed to be dodging and moving around, because you can't really switch too quickly between the two, and it will take some time to actually learn the sort of language of the combat system in terms of when you should do each one. And honestly, that's part of the learning curve for games like this, and that's something that I enjoy, and it does at least pull it off well, and it pulls it off in a learnable way. There are rules, which is why I say that it doesn't feel clunky, because that would sort of imply that it's too difficult to actually get used to, but in this case, since it has an actual rule set and the things actually make sense, you can get used to it. It just takes some time. Another thing that's a little bit different by its inclusion is there's a skill tree that's tied to the leveling system. So every time you level up, every time you put your karma into a stat, no matter which stat it is, you will get these unsealing stones, and you can occasionally also find them as treasure in the world, but that's pretty rare. Generally speaking, the main way you're going to acquire them is by leveling up, and these stones can be used on a skill tree, and the skill tree is somewhat interesting because it's sort of partially gated. The skills are in kind of a straight line that goes by which of the active abilities that you've encountered so far. So in classic Metroidvania fashion, you will find new movement and attacking abilities in the world that you will acquire. Things like being able to attack multiple times in midair, or being able to dash in midair, and some other stuff like that that enhance your overall movement and combat capabilities. And when you've found these things, it will unlock that particular section of this skill tree, and you can then purchase the skills that branch off from that active with these unsealing stones, as you're actually seeing in the background right now. And different nodes take a different number of stones, and you can find everything from simple stuff like increasing your defensive capabilities, which is nice because there isn't really a stat to increase your defense. Like, you can't level up and heavily increase your defense. You actually need to do it in some other way, like using accessories like rings or using these unsealing stones. And you'll also find other things like improving the charge attack types of each weapon, improving the number of devotions that you have, which is basically like this game's version of the spell uses from Dark Souls 1 and 2, where spells have a specific number of uses, very like Vancian magic style, and you have to set which spells you want to use, and then they will consume a certain number of these uses, giving each spell its own kind of different number of casts, and these casts are restored whenever you go to a safe place, like a sort of bonfire-ish statue. It's a save statue. Every room that has a save statue will also have another statue that allows you to spend your karma to level up. So it's very much, although it's two separate things, it is still very much like a bonfire. And yeah, so you can use these stones to improve yourself over time, and it is very much up to you where on the tree that you actually take yourself, of course, with the exception that you have to the initial active skill that the abilities branch off of in order to actually start there. So the skill tree is pretty large, actually. Like, it's not super in-depth, but it is more than I would perhaps expect from something like this, because skill trees and leveling systems are not necessarily what you expect in a Metroidvania. They're not all that common in this genre, perhaps, so it's cool to see, and it does involve a bit of like a difference in character build as far as actual, you know, player choice and character building goes, which is of course one of the best parts of the sort of Souls-like genre. It's very much meant to be around that whole player choice of how you want to build your own character sort of thing. There is quite a lot of variety, actually. You have, as I mentioned, the spells, which are actually called occults, which is an interesting term. The translation for this game isn't perfect. It is a little bit stiff here and there, but I haven't found anything that is like extremely badly translated to the point where it's difficult to understand what they mean. It's not like that, it's just a little bit literal and stiff here and there, and it is actually being improved through patches, which is cool. I understand that localization can be very expensive, so a small team can sometimes take a little while to actually get something localized very very fluently, and that's totally that's acceptable. You know, that's an okay thing to do because it can be expensive otherwise. But yeah, the translation overall is acceptably done. And these occults are your spells. You also have 3 different types of weapons, like 3 different sort of genre of weapon. You have actual swords, and you have what the game translates as broadsword type weapons, which are really like great swords slash axes. They're very heavy, large weapons. And you have lances, so, you know, spears and the like, and halberds. And each one has its own charge attack, its own large sort of critical attack that uses that purple mana gauge, and its own set of ground and aerial attacks. So there is quite a bit of variety in terms of character builds and what you can actually do for yourself and how you sort of want to make your character feel. But given that there are only 4 stats to level into, it's not like Dark Souls level of huge player choice. It's not quite like that, but I don't really think it's trying to be, per se. You know, this isn't like Code Vein. This isn't something that's trying to be very Dark Souls-esque, but with its own style. This is something that's ostensibly a Metroidvania. And it is only adding those other elements in as kind of an aside, as something to spice up the game and not like a main part of the game. So if you treat it as a Metroidvania, it's a really good one, actually. And like I said, it was surprising just how large the game actually was, how many bosses there were, how many enemy types there are, how many places there are to go, how much variety in gear and accessories and magic and stuff there is. And I was just genuinely surprised, like every other step, by the fact that it just kept going, and the fact that there was just more for me to see, because again, that's not very much money for something like this, you know, like $12 to $15 is not a high price of entry for something with this much variety, and I think that it's kind of a shame that very few people actually know about this right now, because it's a lot of fun. The boss fights are interesting, they're usually multi-phase, and they're pretty well done. They don't feel cheap or anything, they feel very learnable, and the attacks are interesting to actually figure out and stuff like that, which is the mark of a good Metroidvania slash a good Souls-like, because both of those genres actually kind of rely on boss fights being quite difficult, but also learnable and having patterns and phases and things that you can actually identify and overcome. So this is a game that is very much worth checking out. The link is in the description below this video to the Steam store page. And I would actually like to see this game get a little bit of a boost in popularity, because it is interesting. It is one of those little things that's hidden among the huge numbers of possible things every day on Steam, you know, and it's something that really deserves to actually be seen and be played, because it's very competent, and it's something that I did not expect to just randomly happen across. And thank you very much to those guys that actually emailed me and let me know about it, because otherwise, like I said, I wouldn't have ever known. So this has been 3000th Duel. Say that a little slowly, because it's still kind of difficult to say. And thank you guys very much for watching. If you want to like this video, then feel free. If you dislike this video, then you can do that too and tell me why so I can improve. And that's the game. Like I said, the link is, as always, in the description. I use Bitly to make it just more like aesthetically pleasing, but it does always link directly to the Steam page. So there you go. Thanks again, and I'll see you guys next time.